Well, I'm really excited to be here, part of Creative Mornings DC. And as Joel mentioned, this is such a cool place here at Union Arts. So I hope you'll come back again and again, because art does live here. It really breathes here. Thank you. And revitalization is the key in DC, right? It's happening right here. Yes, I am an executive director of the DC Jazz Festival, and I am excited every single day to get up and go to work. I've got a very, very cool job. I think I never thought a million years ago that I would be doing this, ever. Because I'm a singer, I'm a performer, I'm a mother, I have 2 beautiful children. Hi, Kobe, hi, Layla. And I was the artist that was touring around the world and wanted to do my thing and never thought about being behind the scenes. In fact, I have a little bit of a crowd phobia. I'm never in a crowd watching music. I can't do it. I've never been able to do it since I've been little. I've always been back behind the stage or right here where I am now. So to be able to be behind the scenes as ED of one of the leading jazz festivals in the country is a privilege, and it's an honor. And why? Because some of the finest jazz musicians in the world happen to reside here in the DMV. No doubt about it. And so if you have not checked out the plethora of artists here, here's an eye-opener for you today. And then you go and you to gcjazzfest.org and like us. And we introduce you through Facebook and Twitter to things that happen all year round in this great city. But I want to tell you a little bit about me. I am uniquely connected to this town, to this gorgeous city. I call it a jazz town. I grew up in Anacostia. I should click this. There's the logo for the festival. I grew up in Anacostia, over in Southeast in Ward 7. And it's interesting because I thought, living up and growing up over there, that was the only DC there was. My school was there, my church was there, my grocery store was there, my family was there. I didn't even know that there were other places in DC. Anacostia was it for me. And what I really loved is going over, who here has been over to see the big chair? Have you, on Martin Luther King? Okay, well that's been around forever. It was given by the Curtis brothers, who were developers over in Ward 8, and it has been there since the 1950s. And what we used to like to do as kids is we would go to that chair and we would climb up it like it were a tree. And we'd stand up on the top and we'd look and we'd think we were looking at the world. It was so very cool for me, and it's an experience that I'll always remember whenever I go to Southeast now, when I see that. And another thing about Southeast, we got to see Chuck Brown in Southeast at the Panorama Room. I lived on Morris Road, and I was young. I would go and we would sneak. We couldn't get in because we were too young, but we'd stand outside and we'd get our go-go on. Chuck Brown was doing it. It was explosive, and I thought, man, this is some cool music. And I even, when I got a little older, was in a go-go band. I thought it was the coolest thing in the world to do. A little bit later, I moved in with my grandmother, and that's when my musical world started to change. You know, I was listening at the time to Michael Jackson and Whitney Houston with my friends. But behind the scenes, I was hanging out with my grandmother, listening to Sarah Vaughan and Ella Fitzgerald, and I thought, wow, the music was speaking to me. These ladies could tell a story. And it was from that, I was singing in the church, and I thought, you know what, I want to do this. I want to do this music. And so I did more of it in the church. I had a mentor up the street, Kevin Toney, who was with a group called the Blackbirds, and I babysat his child so that I could have people come over to the house, and he had Shirley Horn come over and, Keter Betts, and got a chance to meet all these great jazz, again, some of the finest jazz artists in the world happen to live or have lived in this great town. And so that was, I remember Kevin Toney saying, I can get you into Duke Ellington School of the Arts. And I thought, okay. So actually, I was next door. Those of you who are from DC, I was at Georgetown Visitation. And I thought, but I want to be an artist. So I went to Duke Ellington next door in Georgetown. I didn't graduate from there because I was one of the ones that got up in there and just got carried away. Really carried away. But it was the beginning of a musical journey for me that I am so grateful for. From that, I went on to Howard University. I was so glad Howard University had a jazz program. It was awesome. Studying with Grady Tate and Jerry Allen, and being there with Dr. Dawkins. And it was just really incredible, Mr. Irby. And it was from there that I learned, oh my God, jazz is a movement. It's a movement. And so I moved to New York for a few years, and I hung out. I just hung out. I sang as much as I could. I hung out with the musicians. I was hanging out with Roy Hargrove and Christian McBride, and I was doing my thing, and I thought, sneaking into SOBs to hear Gil Scott-Heron, Tito Puente. I was checking out the Latin music with his band at the time. It was just incredible, because what I learned is that music, jazz, there's a little bit of something for everybody. It meets you where you are. So you can be into big band or bebop or swing or soul or neo soul or free soul or gospel soul or jazz. It was so amazing, even the avant-garde. There was an M-bass movement happening in New York with Steve Coleman and Cassandra Wilson, and it was just so amazing during that period. And so, what I think for me is I realized is I wanted to really go back and finish my degree at Howard. So I actually moved back to DC, finished up my degree at Howard, and then I decided, let me start doing this for real. So I started recording. I had the amazing experience, I don't want to get ahead of myself here, yes, of doing an amazing record on Maple Shade. And I couldn't believe who was in the room when I walked in there. Well, I should say I knew in advance, but I had never really been in the room with these three greats. And it was the very late, great Keter Betts on bass, the amazing, extraordinary pianist Larry Willis, and the incredible musical touch of Jimmy Cobb. And I thought, oh my God, I have this amazing plethora of music vocabulary to produce some great music, and we did over a couple of weeks. And this project actually went on to win some audiophile awards, because Maple Shade, which is here in the DMV, prides itself in being, it doesn't use any traditional recording equipment. Actually, the guy, Pierre Spray, would create his own microphone and put a nickel in it, because it would produce a particular sound. Or he would put aluminum foil around cords, again, to produce a certain sound. And that experience for me just really, I'm so grateful to Pierre Spray and the Maple Shade for introducing me to that. And from there, I went and traveled in Russia. And what I realized when you travel around the world as a jazz musician is how much music is a vocabulary. It is its own language. I remember being in Russia, and I'm on a bandstand, and none of the musicians spoke English. And I certainly didn't speak Russian. But once we started to play the music and start improvising and scatting and riffing, and we were having our own conversation. It was so cool. And I thought, wow, look at me. Little old sunny Sumter from Anacostia here in St. Petersburg, Russia, hanging out speaking the music of jazz. It was very, very cool and one of the highlights and joys of my life. So I came back to DC and I said, you know what? I was in love and I got married and I had some children. And I thought, I don't know if I can really tour around the world, because as a jazz artist, back then, and I would say back then, it wasn't too long ago, you made a lot of more money over in Europe. This is before 9/11, and where there were much more opportunities in Europe than there is today. And I remember thinking, I can't be mommy and musician 100%. So I made the choice, and I came back here, and I worked for the Aspen Institute. Now talk about crossover. That's a crossover, right? But the Aspen Institute, any of you familiar with it? With the Aspen Institute? Walter Isaacson, who wrote the book on Steve Jobs, is the president and CEO of that amazing organization. And they bring leaders together to talk about pressing issues of our time. They have a great art program there, by the way. And I did some amazing work with them, just thinking about communications and public policy. And that was a very interesting stint in my life. And while I was doing that, there was a wonderful friend of mine by the name of Charles Fishman, who you see up on the screen now, who was the manager for Dizzy Gillespie. And he toured around the world with him. And when he got back here to DC, he wondered why there wasn't a jazz festival in DC. Because in every major city, there's a jazz festival. So what did he do? He started it on a paper napkin. And he went around to a couple of stakeholders and convinced them that, we could do this. And in 2004, the Duke Ellington Jazz Festival was born, with 12 concerts right along U Street. Who lives over on the U Street area here? Yeah. So I should say this, that growing up here, DC was known as Chocolate City. How many people remember DC as Chocolate City? Well, now it's more like Vanilla City. Oh, I like to say even the rainbow-colored city, because we have now people from all complexions and walks of life here in this great city. But it's a wonderful and pretty amazing to see how DC has really morphed in 5 years, I think. And I think that's why I was asking the question in the beginning, how many people have been here less than 5 years? Because those of you who have been here over 5 years, you've seen it. You've seen this city revitalize itself in every community, in every neighborhood. And one of the things that jazz actually has done is it's actually been part of that revitalization. And the DC Jazz Festival has a way of meeting you where you are. So in 16, maybe even 21 neighborhoods now, we're performing jazz music. And I think the most amazing part of what we do is that we are part of that development, part of that revitalization, part of that creative districting. Anyone here went down to the riverfront, to the Jazz at the Capitol Riverfront at Yards Park? Was there anybody here that was at that wonderful concert last summer or this summer? You were there, right? Wasn't it incredible? Oh my God.
Set and shine on a poor folks too. But I don't mind you turning around. I say I myself now like to know the higher ground. my good people, like an old man standing on the top of the hill, declaring to all of the land, there will be no love dying. Here. Thank you so much.
So since 2009, when we changed from the Duke Ellington Jazz Festival to the DC Jazz Festival, we've seen an upsurge that's very closely connected to the revitalization of the entire city. Its neighborhoods in all 8 wards have really become so, I think we've gotten a real facelift. And according to Forbes magazine, I don't know if some of you know this, but we are now the coolest city in the country. Did you guys know that? When we got that email from Destination DC, which is the tourism part of the city, they go out around the world and tell everybody how cool we are. It was just such a great thing because we know that the reason why DC is so cool is because of the DC Jazz Festival. No, okay, I'm just kidding, but we are certainly one of the reasons why. I think you can hear music anywhere in the city, and it can, again, meet you where you are. So you can find something that works for you, whether it's something that's really heady, like avant-garde, on down to something that's rock, jazz or soul jazz, or even get your church on. And I think that what makes the DC Jazz Festival particularly powerful is our partnership power. We work with business improvement districts around the city, and we create art in spaces like the Yards. Now, who lives in Yards Park? Anybody? You are so fortunate, because it's so cool down there. And what you saw on that video was, you could see the backdrop of the water and the boats going by. That's where he lives. It's a beautiful town down there, and we're working a lot with the Yards to bring more people down there. The idea is that we're creating jazz in urban settings across the neighborhood. It's a program that we call Jazz in the Hoods. During June, every June, we offer about 150 performances in 60 venues. And this picture right here is a great trumpeter by the name of Don Vontae Rocoy, which Mike West for the Washington City paper said that he has the best ensemble for 2013, the best jazz ensemble. I love Don Vontae, and he plays at the 18th Street Lounge. Anybody here gone to hear him? I heard somebody say, hoo-hoo, yes, 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 yes. Yes, indeed. And how many people have been to the National Gallery of Art, to the Jazz at the Garden there? Yes, because you get your sangria groove on there, don't you? It's all about the sangria, but it's about the jazz music there, too. And we have some great people there. And then in Georgetown, we do something at the Dumbarton House with period jazz music most of the time. The Bohemian Jazz Masterworks Orchestra has been there. It's been pretty powerful. And then we do this great that you saw the video on, which is Jazz at the Capitol Riverfront, where you can take your own picnic, bring your own wine. It's one of the few places that's not federal property, that's not the National Park Service, where you can take your wine and have a good old time outside. Or you can take Metro or Uber or taxi or anywhere and check out the Hamilton. Who's been to the Hamilton? Jazz at the Hamilton Live? Yes. We do a whole week and a half there. We love Clyde's Restaurant Group is the owner of that place, if you didn't know that. And they put millions of dollars in to make that a state-of-the-art facility. So if you haven't been to the Hamilton, they don't just do jazz, they do music all year round. So Google them and check out that space too. So again, I'm talking about our partnership power. This is one of the artists, Brassaholics from New Orleans, that played at the Hamilton. And then Cyrus Chestnut, who, if you want to get your church on, you go see Cyrus. Cyrus gets it on. And he's been at 6 and I Historic Synagogue, and you know, he's really helped us with our education programs, because for me, I came into jazz at a very early age because I heard it in many places. Now there are no record stores. You can't hear it on the radio. There's really not that many opportunities for young people to get into the music. So what we do is education all year round, and we do storytelling hours, which is what you're seeing now, where we introduce kids to reading and in jazz-inspired stories. It's a very cool program, and we have another program over in Adams Morgan. It's called Jazz and Sitar, where young kids get to learn about the music in fun and exciting ways, and it's super, super cool. And you know, for me, that's where I think the music is going to breathe the most, is really meeting people, meeting all of you. How many people here have never been to a jazz concert? That's not surprising. And you don't have, you know, it happens. But guess what? You just was here today to hear Elijah do his thing. And, you know, experience it, because again, it will meet you where you are. I think one of the most amazing partners that we have is Capital Bop. And because they do a very edgy, as you can see in this space, you know, a very innovative approach to the music. They bring a lot of new music to DC. And I've talked enough, so I want to bring up my good friend Gio, who's going to tell you a lot about Capital Bop and how this music has really exploded under his umbrella.
Thank you, Sonny. Give it up for Sonny. That was great. Good morning, everybody. Welcome. You've already been welcome. So I guess the theme here is crossing over, and I don't want to hit too hard on it, but I loved all that you were saying about the potential, the development, the amount that jazz can sort of make things move. And what we've always thought of is that jazz captures opposites really easily, contrasts, it holds them together beautifully, and it is a natural crossover music. So whenever we think about developing the city through jazz, it also makes me feel very comfortable, because jazz is a way of remembering, it's a way of being in touch with history and sort of things that have moved the American people throughout, you know? So when you do jazz in DC and you do it honestly and you really do it right, you're celebrating history, and you're celebrating at the same time the very moment you're in, because just like you saw from Elijah this morning, you can't make jazz any way except right in the present moment, you know? That's the one thing that people who, for instance, haven't been to a jazz concert before are always struck by, is how dynamic it was. You know, I was in this moment, I heard music that will never be played again because it was improvised in a way that could never be recreated. And not only that, but I was an active participant, because this maybe sounds new agey and dreamy, but the energy in the room is what feeds that improvisation. The decisions being made, the signals being sent from that brain to those fingers are all informed by who's listening, who's participating, who's giving back the energy, and who's calling and responding, right? So I think of jazz as a really great way of being in touch with the here and now, and also getting your brain and your heart moving at the same time, and also remembering sort of and understanding a lot of things, a lot of baggage that, you know, may come with living in where you are. Because musicians who play jazz have spent years studying the mastery and the masters. So that's sort of, I guess, my understanding of the music and what has always gotten me excited about it. And just to introduce myself, I'm Giovanni Russonello, and I do Capital Bop with my partner Luke Stewart, who's not here at the moment because he's preparing for an amazing concert tonight I'll tell you guys about. But yeah, this is Capital Bop. We started 4 years ago with the dedication to bringing more people like yourselves out to hear and understand and be excited about the music. Because DC, like Sonny illustrated, has a long and incredible history of jazz music, and it only gets stronger and stronger as more generations pile up. So let's just check out a little intro video. Actually, this is perfect. Let's cross over between the DC Jazz Fest and Capital Bop. This is our presentation, our 4th annual presentation of the DC Jazz Fest. It's from this year. Elijah, who you just heard, who's right out there, is the dark, shadowy figure in this picture. And he was at our very first jazz loft. So in terms of the idea of making something dynamic, new, fresh, exciting, and engaging, and honest out of, ancient parts, that was essentially what occurred to us with starting something called the DC Jazz Loft. And that's how Capital Bop got started presenting live shows, reaching out to younger audiences, and as has always been our mission since 2010 when we started, trying to involve every single sort of participant who wants to be involved or who might want to be involved but wouldn't even know it yet. So we really reach across demographics in DC, and we reach across age. And the Jazz Loft essentially was this idea that we had, which was, let's take these informal gatherings of musicians that have always been happening in spaces that are, what did you say? You said like different, radical, something. Some people would say hazardous. And, we started out in Chinatown before Chinatown had quite as many condos.
Oh my God.
And and it was right off 4th Street, and it was definitely a fire hazard in every way. There was a spiral staircase.
Oh my God.
That one of the current resident artists here it literally did break his leg falling down. So you're welcome for not bringing you there. But this was in December 2010, and we had this idea of essentially bringing back an old tradition of jazz lofts, informal, like I said, musical gatherings usually put on by and for musicians, but open to, whoever wants to hang. And I'll get a little into that history later. But I'll tell you, first of all, what was exciting about Red Door, which is what the place was called, it was also known as Gold Leaf Studios over on 4th and I, is that you had visual artists presenting their work. You had using it as a studio. You had rock bands, you had indie bands, you had hip-hop shows, you had everything. And these communities started to sort of mix and mingle really, really naturally. So we got it every single time we put on a show. We would always showcase a variety of different jazz groups. And so if you came and you didn't know a thing about jazz, you were the ideal audience because you got to experience everything and see what you liked. There was, hard rock jazz fusion. There was traditional straight-ahead swinging jazz. There was something called cool jazz, which is like sort of chamber music meets jazz, right? There was avant-garde free improvisation. And when you left, you'd seen it all from different bands, and you just sort of decided, this really spoke to me, this didn't, right? And every single show we had somebody come up to us and say, this is my first time hearing jazz, and I don't understand why I've not done this and why it struck me so much. And really, I think it comes down to that active participant element, which is that everyone who's in the room is giving as much, to the performance as everyone around them. So musicians being part of the audience is part of that. And the whole idea of a jazz loft really began, there's more of Elijah playing at that first loft. But the idea of a jazz loft really began out of necessity, where musicians needed a place to jam. Back in Manhattan in the 50s, they needed a place to stretch out on ideas and not have to maybe concede to the club owner who wanted to sell a drink and get the set to finish right on time, or the theater owner who said, this music is great, but if you're going to play that tune, I can't hire you. So there was this hang that started to happen between about 2 a.m. and 7 a.m. at a loft on 6th Avenue. And it became pretty famous, and it's now especially famous because the dude who ran it was crazy, and he has about 80,000 hours of tape that he very fastidiously compiled. So if you want to hear what a jazz loft sounds like, you can definitely do it. Check out the Jazz Loft Project. But this is Thelonious Monk rehearsing his band for a famous show at Town Hall. And that was at the original Jazz Loft. And then in the 70s, it took on a whole new level of radicalization and sort of artistic what would you call it? Self-autonomy, right? Or autonomy, which is that musicians who really could not get any gigs because they were super avant-garde, they were really improvising in a new and fresh and sort of almost assaultive way, were looking for a way to espouse their music and not have to compromise. And they started a whole scene called the loft jazz scene, where performances were held informally for donation in people's houses, people's apartments. And what you began to get was more than just musicians hanging and playing with musicians, but musicians playing for willing, interested audiences. They would come through and they would, again, become participants. There were panel discussions. There were question and answer sessions. Musicians would perform with poets, and then maybe you would have a poet in the audience who said, I wasn't going to do anything, but here I am, So that was essentially the vibe. And this guy's Bill Dixon, who was a famous trumpeter who celebrated celebrated artistic creativity with one of those first jazz lofts for the avant-garde scene in 1964. It was called the October Revolution in Jazz. It was 4 days over the course of October. And we just put on last week the 50th anniversary commemorative edition of the October Revolution in Jazz here, which was incredible. So that's the history of how jazz lofts essentially allow the music to cross over between the musician, the audience, the other artist, the neophyte who doesn't necessarily know they're going to be so excited by it. You walk into this space, it's raw, it's unmediated, and what you get as a result is unmediated, spontaneous music. So as Capital Bop, we've taken that energy and we've tried to let it blossom into bigger and more perhaps ambitious things. We do a monthly series of lofts, but when Sunny approached us in 2011, we had just begun presenting shows, and she said, I can tell you're getting young audiences, and that can be especially hard in jazz. So why don't we partner and see what we can put together? And through the resources that they've brought for us and the amount of outreach that we've been able to do, we've actually graduated to putting on not only our series at the festival, but also a jazz and wine festival that reaches a totally different demographic, brings out about 2,000 people a year at the fairgrounds. We just became a 501c3 organization last year. We got our first grant this year. We're going to start presenting a little bit more ambitious shows on a regular basis throughout the year. And again, it all has to do with, so this is shots from our Jazz Loft shows at the festival. This was actually downstairs at Union Arts. This is one of our shows where we presented art, another form of sort of crossover, trying to bring the visual arts crowd together with the jazz crowd. That's an example. That's the three piano cutting contest I was talking about. So all of this stuff is happening in June every year. But then that's our Jazz and Wine Festival at the fairgrounds. So there we go. So essentially, when we think about jazz, we really think about it as a way of moving this city forward, but keeping it all rooted. And what I would simply say is that if you are somebody who values an active participant relationship with the art, who thinks of consumption, on the internet as a nice empowering tool because it allows you to choose what you like and get involved in communities, but at the same time you really hunger for that direct involvement with a real-time experience. I think jazz and all artistic creation in spaces like this, where things are open and people can come together on their own terms, it offers us a sort of a way of thinking about calling, responding, creating together. And the idea is simply to hold it all in your head at the same time, these contradictory ideas. This is a written tune, but I'm going to improvise over it for the next 10 minutes and see what happens. This guy was in the audience, and I know he plays some sax, but I don't know whether he plays that well, but we're going to invite him up and see if he wants to join us and make something new. This idea of, okay, well, I've never been to this space, and I definitely don't think it looks like a concert hall, but I'm willing to give it a shot. And I think that as we move forward and DC grows and opens itself to new experiences, it's a really wonderful way of making sure that we celebrate together, but also stay rooted and remember where it all comes from. So thanks to the DC Jazz Festival for allowing that to happen and to building for the past 10 years and 10 and 20 more. And our plan is just to keep going.
And you definitely do that. I mean, the innovative approach to jazz that Capital Bop brings, that loft element to the city is just so incredible, and we really appreciate that. So I didn't know if I put a plug that the June Festival in 2015 is the 10th through the 16th. And so you can go to dcjazzfest.org and like us on Twitter or Facebook, and so you can get a hip to all of this. And we should probably open it up at this time.
Sure, but also one last thing is that as we keep growing, we're doing more and more different venues. We like the traditional venues just as much. We like to bring this new energy, this kind of openness to those spaces. And tonight is a great example. We're going to have a crazy cosmic costume contest and parade that ends at the Lincoln Theater, where Sun Ra, anybody? Sun Ra? And his famous orchestra. He's no longer with us, but his orchestra is going to be performing at the Lincoln Theater, and the Lincoln Theater has never gotten quite that funky. So I'm sure it's gotten very funky, but this is really next level in terms of it's Halloween every day for this band.
Exactly,
so,
it's apropos
you guys
for its Halloween.
should check it out, see how the energy jives with a traditional space like Lincoln Theater, and yeah, follow us, Capital Bop, on Facebook and Twitter and all that, so that you can keep abreast of all those developments.
And I was going to actually bring that up at the very end so they could walk away with that, but
Okay.
I'm happy that you mentioned it.
Stay ahead of the beat, sorry.
And the DC Jazz Festival is certainly proud to be a education and community partner of the Sun Ra Orchestra that will be
Yes,
performing this
yes.
weekend.